Hey guys, your video lesson for chapter 22. Most of the first video we should get in class. They should be shorter video. Both videos should be a little shorter than normal hopefully. So we'll go through, finish your videos. We'll discuss a little bit more in depth on Monday. So today we're going to add a little bit to the John Green decolonization video that you guys watched before. We're going to talk about how these large European empires particularly come to end in the post-war period. So during this period, the early 1900s to really the 1970s, you have the confluence of some different forces that lead to the downfall of empires. The rise of nationalism and the idea of self-determination combined to create the desire for independent nations amongst the previous colonies of Europe. And as a result, you have the formation of several new nation states that rise on the international level. Suddenly, empires become illegitimate. The entire concept of empire becomes discredited in the post-World War I and World War II periods as there is the growth of the belief that people should be divided into self-determined states that represent people's will and desires. And as you can see in this map, those wills and desires are expressed in the creation of new nations, primarily in Africa, but also in the Middle East and in East Asia and Southeast Asia as well. And you can see 1960 is kind of the tipping point for this. It is known as the Year of Independence, when several former European colonies become independent in that year. So these colonies have been controlled in some cases for over 100 years by European countries. So what is it that happens during the early parts, or the first half of the 20th century that leads to the rise of African and Asian independence? Well, the first is World War I and World War II give lie to the legitimacy of empire. There is a contradiction or hypocrisy present in here. You have European ideals of Christian humanity and belief in the Enlightenment values of Europe that don't jive with the injustices that are present in colonial rule. And you also have some new forces after World War II that rise. You have the weakening of Europe, specifically Britain, France, and the Netherlands. And you have the rise of the United Nations, which offers a new forum for arguing the anti-colonial cause. The Soviet Union is specifically active in arguing against imperialism. Although they were imperialistic, they just didn't view themselves as that way. So several colonizers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands particularly, began to divest or basically remove themselves from their colonies. But now they also seek to establish favorable economic relationships with these former colonies as well. Also, you're going to have a new generation of elite people, colonial people, that rise to become leaders of these new movements. These are people who are often Western educated. They go to schools in the West. They learn military strategy and tactics from Western forces, and they gain knowledge of how to mobilize mass-based nationalist parties and use that education and that education to challenge colonialism. And you have a number of charismatic leaders rise up in these various colonies. In settler colonies like South Africa or Australia, you had intransigent empires like the Portuguese territories. You have these people volunteering to join the ranks of freedom fighters to end foreign or, in the case of South Africa, white domination. So as we look at these independence movements, India gives us a really good look at one way in which these nations gained their independence. First of all, India was struggling to define what it means to be Indian. South Asia was very diverse. Lots of different ethnic, religious, and racial groups lived in the Indian colony, and few of these people identified as Indian. They identified more closely with what region they were from, what caste they belonged to, or even whether they were Hindu or Muslim. However, the Indian National Congress, which was formed in 1885, is going to start to try to change this. They are a nationalist organization that claims to represent all Indians. And initially, the Indian National Congress seeks to work within the British system for greater opportunities and equality for Indian people. At first, it was dominated by Indian elites, the highest educated, most wealthy of Indian people. And World War I is going to be a real tipping point for these people. It changes the situation in India. Britain had promised, in return for Indian soldiers fighting in World War I, the British had promised democratic reforms. And when that didn't happen, there were protests against the British government that resulted in violent acts of repression, such as the Amritsar massacre. And you add this to the fact that wartime basically depleted the economies of these colonies and contributed to the spread of the influenza pandemic that impacted not just Europe, but also European colonies. And it creates a situation where more and more people are becoming dissatisfied with the rule of European country. So into this situation comes a British educated lawyer by the name of Mohandas Gandhi. And he believed in the Hindu idea of satyagraha, which meant truth force. And it was the basis for his belief on nonviolent civil disobedience. And this idea was to shame the British into basically quitting their Indian colony. He did want women to play a role in the movement, which was different than most mainstream Indians were picturing at the time. Boycotts and marches kind of lay the backbone of this resistance. Also, hunger strikes play a role as well. Not everyone, however, agrees with the Indian National Congress's view of Indian nationalism. Muslims specifically were uncomfortable with plans for a democratic majority Hindu state. They didn't trust that the majority Hindu population would protect Muslim rights and beliefs. And they disagreed with the Congress's Hindu rhetoric. And they represented the largest of the dissenting parties. And they're led by a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And he was the head of the Muslim League. He wanted the creation of a Muslim majority state in order to protect Muslim rights. This results in the creation of East and West Pakistan in 1947, as the British quickly divided India into a Hindu majority India with East and West Pakistan on either side as Muslim majority states. And so in the year of independence and partition, 12 million refugees either move east or west depending upon their religious leanings. And over 1 million died in violence as a result of the populations migrating. Migrating populations run into each other. There would be violence. And Gandhi decried this violence, but he himself is actually a victim of it as well. He's murdered, he's assassinated by a Hindu man who thinks that he's too chummy with Muslims. So as you can see, India, the former British colony of India, which is represented by the blue line here, is divided into India, the nation of India, which is majority Hindu, and the nation of East and West Pakistan, which is obviously problematic, and eventually East Pakistan will fight a civil war to become its own nation of Bangladesh in 1971. But the Pakistans are both majority Hindu nations, or Muslim nations, whereas India is a majority Hindu nation. Now, in South Africa, you have a much different situation. It was independent. It gained its independence in 1910 from Great Britain, but you had rule by the white minority, which represented less than 20% of the population. These whites were made up mostly of wealthy British colonists and a larger group of descendants of the Dutch Boer farmers that initially colonized South Africa. These people are called Afrikaners today. In South Africa, unlike many African nations, you very quickly have a mature industrial economy develop after independence, and it's based heavily on low-wage African labor. And non-whites were subject to very restrictive laws. They restricted where they could live, where they could work, where they could travel. There were almost no political rights. Poverty was widespread among non-white populations. And in answer to this, you had the rise of the African National Congress in 1912. And it used a tactic similar to the Indian National Congress to try to end white domination and apartheid. And you see the map here in the top left-hand corner of your screen. The dark purple were the places where 80% or the non-white population, which is 80% of the overall population of South Africa, are forced to live, whereas the smaller 20% white population was had all of the lighter purple. The places where non-whites were forced to live were generally in the poorest, the areas with the poorest land, the least usable resources, and as a result, there were high concentrations of poverty in these regions. So, in effect, South Africa sets up reservations for non-white, for the non-white majority. So, the African National Congress was opposed by the National Party's apartheid, and this was the white supremacist party that refused to reform the apartheid system of racial segregation. It was into this situation that Nelson Mandela rose as the leader of the African National Congress. And he represents a new generation of leadership. He came to power and was imprisoned by the white government. As a result of repressions and imprisonment of its leaders, the ANC comes to believe that nonviolent resistance is not going to be able to do the trick, and they turn to violent means to try to oppose the white rule. Assassinations, guerrilla attacks, what South Africans would call terrorism, was the way the ANC transitioned into this resistance. There was mounting pressure on South Africa in the latter part of the 20th century to end apartheid. This included boycotts from many nations, although the United States did not do it. The U.S. Congress passed a law basically boycotting South Africa and South African goods, but it was vetoed by Ronald Reagan. Also, countries came together to ban South Africa from participation in the Olympics. Finally, in 1994, President F.W. de Klerk of South Africa begins to loosen apartheid restrictions. He frees Mandela from prison, who is then very quickly elected president in the first truly democratic election in South African history. Mandela becomes the president of South Africa. However, there is still continued violence. Apartheid is dismantled, but violence persists, mostly between rival political factions such as the African National Congress and the Zulu-based Inkatha Freedom Party. So there still is conflict today. All right, so we're going to end it right there. We'll pick back up in the next video and finish up. Talk to you guys later. Bye.